So, thank you very much. This is a continuation of our lecture series, the Anthropocene lectures, which is hosted by 3 different institutions cooperating all together, and that's the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, and of course the ISS in Potsdam, which is hosting this particular lecture. And I'm very delighted to introduce our distinguished guest to you, Karen Litfin. And I'm particularly happy because it was a very spontaneous idea. I read a paper that Karen wrote as many as 14 years ago, which absolutely fascinated me. So I wrote to her excitedly, and we developed the idea of hosting a lecture by Karen at the Institute further on. And now she's here, and she's been here already for a week. It's been a great, great pleasure. Thanks again, Karen, for coming. And we're very curious to hear your lecture. Let me briefly say a few words that you could also read online, and if there's plenty more information, I'll keep it short. Karen has been on the Political Science and Environment Studies faculty at the University of Washington since 1991. Her books include Ozone Discourses, Science and Politics in Global Environmental Cooperation, and The Greening of Sovereignty. And most recently, I just wanted to show that book to you, or Karen will show it to you maybe later on, and we can show it around, on Eco-Villages, her latest book, of which I think she has several copies for some people who might be interested. Later on, get in touch with her. We're delighted that you're here yet again, and it's your floor, Karen, for now. Thank you very much for coming.
So thank you, Franz, for the invitation and the introduction. I had a feeling that the week before Christmas would not be the time to get a large audience, so I thank all of you for being here. And hopefully we make it worth your while. So, yeah, a couple of people here are noticing that I have this Eco-Village book, and I won't be talking about that. But what I will say, I think, is very relevant to that book. So what I'm going to talk about today is the body politic. And by that I mean all of us collectively and how we become political agents and citizens, really, in the Anthropocene. And I'll be integrating some of my thinking and my experience in exploring what I referred to actually in the article that Franz talked about as the integral perspective. And the integral to me is actually integrating the body, the heart, the mind, and the awareness of ourselves as existing in a planetary age, and bringing that into the socio-political realm. So, I think I will, just because I like to do this, start with a poem. That's what I do with my classes, and some of what we'll be doing today is actually drawn from the work that I do with my students. And I've done some of this work as well with Okay, I took it out, actually, because I want you to listen to this and feel it more than read it. But you can do as you like. This is being a person. Be a person here. Stand by the river. Invoke the owls. Invoke winter, then spring. Let any season that wants to come here make its own call. After that sound goes away, wait. A slow bubble rises through the earth and begins to include sky, stars, all space, even the outracing, expanding thought. Come back and hear the little sound again. Suddenly, this dream you are having matches everyone's dream, and the result is the world. If a different call came, there wouldn't be any world, or you, or the river, or the owls calling. How you stand here is important. How you listen for the next things to happen. How you breathe. And so this is about being a person. Yeah, we are all people, and I think part of what we're doing in the Anthropocene is learning to be persons in the Anthropocene. So I've been exploring this not only from a cognitive perspective, but also from what I was explaining as an integral perspective that really unites the body, the emotions, the heart, and action. So it's not just about experience, but it's about bringing experience into the world. So I work with students and activists, and I've done some work as well with people in the policy realm. And I've written some of this up in an article called Person, Planet, Politics, Pedagogies, Contemplative Pedagogies for a New Earth. So I would say we are, at this moment, becoming aware of ourselves as a planetary species. And there's so many dimensions to that. What does it mean to be a person in the Anthropocene? What, when, and how did we get here? Who are the winners and losers? What does it mean to live sustainably? Is that even possible on a global scale? And how does all of this affect our sense of self? And then how do we bring that self into the world of action? And I would say that the planetary is something beyond the global. So since I've been teaching now for, believe it or not, 40 years, and at least I hope not to look that old, but maybe I do. And since I've been teaching in the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, I've asked my students, to what entity do you feel a sense of allegiance? Do you feel a sense of identification? And I would, start with local, city, and move up to nation state, and then I would ask, do you feel a sense of global citizenship? And increasingly, in the last few years, more than half of the students, maybe 3/4 of the students, say that they do feel themselves to be a global citizen. And I think this comes as a consequence of the internet, consequence of becoming aware of global problems, including global environmental problems. But planetary, I think, is slightly of a different order. It's global, but it's not only the human dimension, it's also the planetary dimension. It's the sense of ourselves as being of the earth. So I would say globalization didn't start in the 20th century, didn't even start with colonialism. We've been a global species in some ways from the get-go. This is the movement of Homo sapiens for over the course of 200,000 years, including other hominid species who we largely displaced. You can also find genetic globalization, the tracking of chromosomes through time, biological globalization. This is the Columbian exchange of different foods as well as diseases across the Atlantic during the period of colonialism. And this colonialism that brought us the political globalization of the nation state into territorial, distinct, sovereign territories. The nation state has been essentially globalized. And I talk about this quite a lot more in the integral politics piece that we'll be discussing in the colloquium starting around 3:30 today. So with the awareness of planetary boundaries, with Earth system science that tells us that we are crossing certain thresholds into another geological epoch, we are learning that we are actually planetary agents, and we didn't even know. It was just a colossal accident, which I think is one of the most amazing things about the Anthropocene, is that we had such agency without any intentionality. So Earth system science gives us this planetary view, and I'm skating over so much here, but mostly it's because I want to bring us more into the experiential realm of this. So Earth system science gives us the analysis of events through the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, the water, the biosphere, the life, all impacting and being impacted by events. And what I sometimes write in here, what I have here is, where are the people? Somehow we are an event. We are somehow embedded in all of this. And some people have talked about the noosphere as the other sphere that's profoundly altering these other spheres of the Earth system. So the profound question for the Anthropocene I feel, is how do we integrate human systems into the Earth system? I love this cartoon. You know, you're all familiar with the Goldilocks phenomenon. I don't know, in Germany, do you have Goldilocks, this fairy tale? Maybe not. Yeah, it's Goldilocks. She visited, anyway, we won't go into the fairy tale, that Venus is too hot, the Mars is too cold, Earth is just right, and we're eating it all up. And if you see down here at the bottom, maybe Mars isn't too cold. And there's people who are taking that possibility very seriously and exploring other planets. But wherever we go, we somehow need to bring our earthly support system in some form or another, because that's the thing that we are fundamentally embedded in. So when my students begin to understand this, that we are somehow destroying or unraveling the planetary systems upon which we are utterly dependent, they sometimes get quite depressed, angry. They didn't do it, somebody else did it, and it's foisted upon them. And now, as young people, it's said they have responsibility for solving the problems. So understandably angry and guilty, because most of them are Americans and they're all living in the US and they feel that they're responsible for this. And very often paralyzed. They don't know what to do about problems of such magnitude. And many of them fall at some point or another prey to what I call the misanthropic temptation. The misanthropic temptation, I don't think you can necessarily read this whole thing, but it's actually taken from a deep ecology publication, which I kind of like, because it shows that the deep ecologists can have a real sense of humor. How deep is your ecology? Well, the profoundly deep is humans are too great a threat to live on Earth. The species should be phased out. And then the abysmally deep, that a quick annihilation is too good for humans. A horrible fatal illness from outer space is only fair. So I think it's pretty much impossible to be a human being and actually adhere to this perspective. But I do believe that anybody who's taken these issues seriously, maybe not anybody, but many people, including myself and my students, have at least entertained the misanthropic temptation that there's something wrong with us, that we don't belong here. We're not living like we belong on the planet, so maybe we really don't belong here. And that's a hard perspective to take seriously. And by the way, this is put out by the voluntary human extinction movement. I think, I think it's meant in humor, I don't know for sure. But all of this is giving rise to a lot of proliferation, I would say, of social imaginaries at the dawn of the Anthropocene, ranging from the kind of global ecological utopian visions to the profoundly dystopian visions of technological development outstripping human morality, technological developments like artificial intelligence, et cetera, pandemics, et cetera. So there's all kinds of social imaginaries out there in the political sphere right now. And I think it's important to understand technology or politics as being, in some way, an expression of intentionality, collective intentionality. What is it that we are moving towards? And so the social imaginary is very important, because in some ways it maps out, or it doesn't map out, but it articulates the intention or the purpose to which a collective is moving. And so I've developed in my teaching and also in my work with activists and anybody who wants to do it, actually, anybody, what I call person-planet politics. And it's basically a way of approaching these global issues that can seem so abstract and overwhelming and terrifying and depressing from the perspective that actually It's not all happening out there. It's not being foisted upon us. To some extent, to a great extent, we are not the sole agents as individuals, but it's not to bring it home, essentially, is what I'm trying to do. To actually bring the global, abstract, large-scale home. So my field actually began with international law, international environmental law. And I do a lot of teaching, and I've done some writing about international treaties, and I think they're very important. I think the world would be worse off if we didn't have international law, but it also is very slow and cumbersome, and it can give the impression that that people are not empowered, that this is really up to technocrats and experts. So one of the things that I look at in my person-planet politics approach is the question of how can learning, particularly of learning about these very troubling issues, be very personal and also be very empowering. And this, I think, is a way of short-circuiting the misanthropic temptation, to actually find a sense of a meaningful human existence in the context of that which can feel overwhelming. And so what I ask is, can we feel what we know? Can we know what we feel? And can we act accordingly? And I think these are really important questions to ask at the dawn of the Anthropocene, because clearly the accidental nature of the Anthropocene suggests that we haven't really known what we were doing, that there's so much unconscious at work right now. And I would say one of the things that's happening in the political arena, and I won't go much into this, but is that there's a kind of revelation, one revelation after another, of things that have been hidden but were there all along. The shadow, the collective shadow of racism and sexism and and greed, et cetera. So there's so much that's being revealed right now. You could say we live in an apocalyptic moment. An apocalypse is not the ending, cataclysmic ending of something. It actually means the lifting of a veil. So we're living in a time right now of lifting of veils, becoming more conscious of what we've been unconscious of. So Aldo Leopold, great environmental thinker, he said that to receive an environmental education is to live permanently in a world of wounds. And I think anybody who has studied these issues knows what he means by that. But he also says, we cannot bring back what has been lost, but we can bring our whole selves to what is here. And that's what I try to do in integrating these somatic experiences and emotionally integrative experiences into our cognitive learning. So he also said that we need to learn to think like a mountain. And I would say we need now to learn to think like a planet. And that actually requires feeling. So emotions and sensations, these are bodily experiences. And thinking itself is actually a bodily experience. If you look at just simple neuroscience, you learn that all learning is predicated upon the bodily experience of infancy. And then and then the mind constructs essentially like metaphors. So, poetry is a wonderful gateway into some of these metaphors. So what I do with these person-planet politics approaches is that I engage students and anybody else who wants to do this with me in contemplative practices that foster self-awareness, empathy, compassion, and the capacity to handle complexity and to take multiple perspectives as a way to integrate the mind and heart, to integrate, say, science and poetry, and to integrate the personal and political. So I'm going to give you some windows into some of these practices, and I'd like to maybe even, let me just check it out with you. just give me an indication. Do you feel like you'd like a little bit of experiential experience of this, or would you like just me to talk about it? So give me a hands up if you'd like a little bit of experience of this. Okay, great. Well, that's most of you, so we're going to do that then. And I'll just give a little credit here to one of my sources, and that's David Abram's book, Becoming Animal. He has many practices in the book for embodying this kind of consciousness. So one of the first things that happens when we turn the mind's attention to itself, to its own contents, is we just see how utterly distracted we are. And so, I suggest maybe just to kind of take a moment and just notice what's happening in your thoughts. Where do they go? One thing that is fun to play with a little bit is just imagine that you're going to reach for your cell phone and notice what happens in your body. And there's a lot that's been written now on internet addiction. My students, they certainly know a lot about this. So we do practices, for instance, around mindful use of technology. So one of the practices I like to do is actually around the Keeling curve. So part of what I like to do is kind of integrate the rational with the sensory. So when we look at this, we see the upward trend that's given us close to 408 parts per million just a few days ago. And we all are very familiar with this. But this little up and down jogging is actually the planet breathing. And so we breathe all the time. We breathe in air, and of course the main thing we're looking for in our body is the oxygen. And we breathe out certain trace gases, including CO2, and that's not a problem, even though it's a greenhouse gas. So I invite you just to take a moment and notice that you're breathing. And sometimes there's things we can do with our breath just to calm the mind, noticing maybe a prolonged emphasis on the exhale. It's helpful sometimes to just even sigh or just let a nice long exhale go. Because when we're anxious, which is a common state of mind, very often we are somewhat holding our breath. And then another practice is actually to think about the planet from a spatial perspective. So this is a NASA photograph that I like to use after I've done some talking about climate change and ozone depletion. This is actually the layers of the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is been called the thin blue line. It's like the Earth's membrane. And it's really what environs the whole planet and makes it possible to have a living planet in the same way that a cell has a membrane that protects it. So, we can do a lot of practices around our breath and the fact that that breath is of a piece, you literally could say, with the atmosphere and the stratosphere. And my first book was on the ozone treaties, and I like to help students remember, for all the cynicism that exists right now in international law, we actually do have a set of treaties that has been wildly successful for the most part. And that's the international regimes around stratospheric ozone depletion. And if we didn't have those treaties right now, we would be at least as concerned about ozone depletion as we are about climate change. I would say probably more so, because it would be more urgent in some ways. So the stratosphere is actually what makes it possible for terrestrial life to exist. Stratospheric ozone, I should say. So we're utterly dependent upon this. And to do practices around acknowledging interdependence, And breath is an excellent way of doing that. That the breath is a kind of another example of our porous membranes. It's only through our ability to let in oxygen and breathe out, carbon dioxide that we live. And we don't make it happen. It happens on its own. It's an aspect of life. And we don't decide usually to breathe. And so there's a certain way in which when you tune into these practices, you can foster a sense of trust in life processes. And that element of trust, I think, is very, very important for us right now, because there's ways that facing the problems that we're looking at today can make us feel distrustful and anxious. So coming back to our senses, literally coming to our senses. I also teach a food politics course, Political Ecology of the World Food System, and that's a great entry point into interdependence. So we do contemplations around lots of different kinds of food, chocolate, for instance, the sweet and the bitter, and the fact that the cocoa farmers in West Africa who grow most of our cocoa, they don't eat chocolate. And to understand ourselves actually in a society like this, the US and Germany, in any affluent culture, we are the beneficiaries of a global economy. And to take that in, really take it in, not solely from a perspective of guilt or a sense of wrongness about it, but that it is how it is. Another set of practices that I like very much, and again, the metaphors from nature can be very powerful. A tree. Just for a moment, I offer you the opportunity to actually imagine that you have roots. And you might feel it through your pelvis, you might feel it through your feet, reaching down. And then there's metaphors around the soil. The soil is the decomposition of life. And that today, we rest on a basis of the past. We actually build the present and the future on the basis of an archaeology of the past. Actually noticing gravity. One of the aspects of a planet is it has a gravitational force. How many of us ever even experienced that reality? It's eye-opening when you do, because it actually, it actually kind of grounds you to experience your relationship with gravity. It can. I invite you to try it for yourself. And the tree is a lovely metaphor because not only does it have its rootedness in the earth, it also has a reaching quality. And you can imagine, you can also play with your breath in this way. That when you exhale, you might notice a kind of settling. And when you inhale, you might notice a kind of reaching, or it might be vice versa for you, but the reaching, or the sense of aspiration, upliftment, and rootedness at the same time. And when you feel this in your body, I would suggest, when I feel it in my body, I'm transmitting different qualities. Another lovely metaphor is that of a seed. So in many languages, intention and purpose, same word as seed, which I think is really interesting. And this Mexican proverb, they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize we were seeds. So seeding of intention, taking root and germinating an idea. And one of the things that's most important in the Anthropocene is that we do these practices, and we do when we become people, when we become real persons, we bring it into the collective somehow. So I've been working with these contemplative practices in the classroom for a long time, actually almost 20 years. And I should say part of the ways that I got into this is that I also became overwhelmed with these issues. And I needed to find ways of finding more inspiration and a deeper sense of meaning in the face of all of this. So part of the problem with these practices, though, is that you can get quite, you can go into your little mindfulness bubble, you know, and that can be a good respite, and it serves a purpose. But how does that change anything in the world? And so I'm interested in collectivities rooted in these kinds of practices and opening themselves to creative inspiration to see what they might do. So in the last few years, I've been developing study action groups that integrate the contemplative practices with a goal of bringing something into the polis. And so I play with, and I invite people to play with agency and a sense of intersubjectivity that can come about when you do practices that are rooted in trying to access your deepest humanity into a collective, and bringing that into a collective purpose. And then learning from that. So not only trying to do a project in the world for the outcome, but also doing it as an exercise in learning. So many practices for doing just that, bringing a collectivity more deeply together. And I would say people are working in groups all over the place. I happen to work with students primarily, and to a lesser extent with activists. But you know, any group of people can harness these kinds of practices towards fostering a greater sense of collective intentionality and efficacy. So you might say, well, how is all of this landing with the students? So over the last few years, I've been taking some survey data, and I've actually got a lot of data on this, a lot of qualitative data and some more quantitative. This is just as a sample. I asked the students to answer a simple question, very often at the end of a particular practice, but also in terms of the whole semester's work. How do you assess the value of these practices? They were a welcome respite from my otherwise busy life. That's about 62% of the students. So that's actually most of them, and I'm going to speak to that in a little bit. About 30%, 30 to 35%, say that they got profound insight into either themselves or the world. That, I think, is worth a lot, actually. 6% are fairly neutral, and 2%, it's usually between 1% and 2% of the students think it's a waste of time. And that's fine, because in any given teaching experience, there's no doubt that some things that are being done will land with some people and others won't. And so I feel that that's fine. But this 62%, that's actually, does that require justification? Well, I would say it does. And my own sense is that we actually generally don't have enough time to think through things very deeply. And so many people, one of the first things that people very often recognize when I do these practices in groups is that they realize that they're tired. You know, many of us, I don't know about most of us, but many of us are going around very tired almost all the time. That's worth noticing. Do you know? It's important to acknowledge that. And there's actually a skill that I've developed. I'm actually a little bit right now doing that. Resting in exhaustion. Actually contacting your sense of exhaustion and being with it rather than resisting it. That's a very different attitude towards tiredness. Anyway, so we work with this 62% of the respite period. You know, why is that important? I do believe that pedagogically it's very important. If we didn't sleep, we'd go crazy. We need respite. And very often inspiration comes out of it. And it'll be different people who are in the different groups. I mean, maybe one particular day you think it's a waste of time, and another day you get a profound insight, you know. So, as I said, I've been bringing this into the action projects, and this is actually what I'm very excited about. So I'm going to give you some just samples of the websites that my students have developed. This is one course of Anthropocene politics, and the students self-select themselves into groups, And then they develop, on the basis of the contemplative practices, they develop projects that they take out into the world. And they have an assignment, and it's got to have some kind of political dimension to it. So it's what we call taking it to the polis. And universally, this is my students' favorite part of the courses, because they feel that they're doing something. And I don't know about students in Germany, but in the US, young people feel politically disempowered, which is why so many of them, if they think about making a difference in the world, they think about taking a shorter shower and becoming a vegan. That's the kinds of things that people are thinking, because they can't imagine themselves as being political agents. And so these projects, they're small, they're just small steps, but they are creating a sense of political agency. And they're giving students a sense that they can do something and make a difference. And the most surprising thing that most of them report is when they're out in the public, when they're interacting with people, they're surprised that people actually want to have these conversations with them. And they say, well, I was so afraid to do this. I thought that I would be embarrassed. I thought that I would be, that nobody would want to talk to me. But actually, everybody wants to talk about this. So this is Political Ecology of the World Food System. This is the course that I'm still grading papers for, Planetary Politics, Human Beingness in the Anthropocene. And I am completely moved by the quality of the students' experiences and the projects that they brought out. They also have been doing creative projects, individual projects, rooted in their experience of the contemplative practices. This is one student's photograph where she talks about the bubble of individualism and learning about ecological and social connection. A nice meditation to do on some of this is actually meditating on the spaces between us, the air between us, the water that connects, the space between our thoughts. Because when you look at your mind and you see how completely chaotic it might be, sometimes actually paying attention to the space between the thoughts, the space between the breaths, can be very helpful. So to also bring the aesthetic dimension of all of this into the personal and the political, can we even imagine a politics rooted in some sense of beauty? And that's what a lot of the students end up being able to do. So I would say that these are very small examples, but it's a kind of grassroots approach to planetary politics. I would love to see these kinds of practices being enacted at higher levels of politics. My sense is that the consequences and the policies that came out of those governance bodies would be less disembodied and more deeply empathic. So I see this as a kind of organic intersubjectivity of becoming persons together in the Anthropocene and then enacting planetary social imaginaries. So I want to say finally, and then I will end and open for questions, that I mentioned that I started doing this about 20 years ago, and when I first started doing this, I actually did it secretively. And I was quite concerned that my senior faculty would learn that I was doing this because I wasn't tenured yet. And so it was kind of scary for me to be asking the students to meditate on their breath in an international relations class with 400 students. Why are we doing this? Do you know? And over time, what's happened is that there's a lot of neuroscience that say these kinds of practices actually work. And there's other faculty doing it. So now there's an organization called the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Society, and one of its spin-off projects, the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. And they got started in 2009, which was the same year that a group of us in the Pacific Northwest, environmental studies faculty from all over the Puget Sound bioregion, from really about 50 or 60 different universities and colleges. We got together and formed the curriculum for the bioregion and started sharing the fact that we were all doing these weird things with our students, in large part because we saw how utterly overwhelmed the students were with the material. And so we developed this lovely learning community that's been meeting regularly for the last 8-9 years. And we have put our practices up on a website at Carleton University. And you can, so there's hundreds of practices, contemplative environmental studies practices there. We also, I didn't even mention it, we also came out with a book last year on contemplative sustainability education in higher education with Routledge Press. So this strange thing that was quite alternative and that I hid 20 years ago, I see it now as being kind of at the leading edge of teaching. And there's increasingly large amount of data that shows that this stuff actually works. It improves learning. I'm also involved in a large end study right now where we'll be tracking the impact of these practices on students' grades. So one of the things you need to show to the faculty and administrators is, does it have that kind of effect? I feel absolutely certain that it does from student feedback, but I also want to see if it's true by doing the study. So yeah, that's what I have to say, and I would love to have some conversation and some questions, and whatever you would like.
I'm very interested to hear about what you've done with this Association for Contemplative Mind and Society, and for bringing together people who have made attempts at bringing such practices into the classroom and to other settings. And I know what you mean about how that can be a little bit hair-raising. I remember back when I was first doing that with group meetings, and I'd have 30 or 40 people in a room and have them sitting for a minute or two quietly. It was less the concern about the 1 or 2% in the room who might think this is really just a waste of time, let's get on with it. The greater concern was what about when somebody who has no idea of what's going on walks in to the room and sees everybody sitting there quietly and thinks, what kind of a bozo is that there? What's wrong with them? So the attempt to investigate the effect that this has on students' brains or on students' learning capacity, on the one hand, I find very laudable because it can lead to a greater acceptance. But on the other hand, it actually worries me a little bit because it can also lead to an instrumentalization, to a misuse of the techniques. And this I had never really thought about until I had the opportunity to speak to a friend of mine who had suffered a pretty severe burnout and was sent to a German clinic and learned techniques for dealing with the stress at the workplace. And when she came back and I was talking with her about some of it, and she knew that I have a meditative practice, she said one of the things that she was taught there was be very careful that this ability to help you deal with life around you through a meditative practice ending up leading you to thinking about increasing effectivity, be careful that that doesn't lead into sort of what we might call a slippery slope of increasing your ability to tolerate suffering in the shadow of responsibility or ambition.
Yes.
And so I see that as a very tight rope that is being walked with looking at the balance of this ineffectivity. And I see, on the one hand, the contemplative practices could help a great deal to bring the morality which is typically associated with them into the policy sphere, into the classroom, into broader society. But on the other hand, it can, like you said, in consumer applications or in commercial applications, it can very quickly become instrumentalized. So what's your experience about the balance between those two?
Just genius. Thank you, Mark. You just touched on so many points that I feel are very important. When I mentioned the mindfulness bubble, and that's actually been one of my main problems with the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. It's very much informed by the mindfulness movement. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Kabat-Zinn's work. He created a practice called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it's used in many hospitals now. It's also used a lot in mental health profession. And it is about stress reduction. So here's the thing about stress. If we are anxious about something, our emotion might be telling us something that we need to be anxious about. Do you know? And so do we want to circumvent that and be in our mindfulness bubble? Or do we actually want to act upon the anxiety? So anxiety, I think, is a very important social emotion. But it shouldn't run rampant. We want to integrate that into our cognitive capacity. We want to increase our capacity for all emotions, not just a particular bandwidth. And so one of the things that I do with that I've brought into the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education is the political nature of these practices. So asking the question, to what end are they being put? What's the purpose that they're serving? The Pentagon actually does use mindfulness practices. And probably the most prominent example in American culture is football. The Seattle Seahawks that have won the Super Bowl a number of times and have star players. Their coach, the owner, is Paul Allen, who partnered with Microsoft and who is a firm believer in contemplative practice and mindfulness, and he wanted to see what would happen if you had a football team that was really deeply infused with mindfulness practices. Well, what happens is that they keep winning, and they have some star players, and you have some beautiful examples of this from their star quarterback, Russ Wilson, talking about. He doesn't usually refer directly to mindfulness practice. But the way he speaks, you can tell that he's in touch with a wide range of, he's very in touch with a wide aspect of himself. And he develops from that a lot of courage and also the capacity to see a lot happening on the field all at once. So sometimes I watch him play. I'm not a big football fan, but you watch him play and there's 10 huge men coming at him all at once, and he's got the ball, and he knows just what to do with it. And it's because he's so in the moment, do you know? And so the Seattle Seahawks have done a lot to bring mindfulness into the public arena. And that's great, but that's not necessarily the end to which I'd like to see it put. It's important, I think, but it's not, I'm not sure how that will help us navigate the Anthropocene. Maybe if we become the kinds of people that can have 10 men coming at us and we have the football, we'll do better with the Anthropocene. But I think asking this question, to what end is it being put? And then bringing these practices that can be quite solitary because you come more deeply into your own personal experience. And you can in some ways luxuriate in that, but bringing that into the intersubjective field. So I almost never do a practice in a classroom where I only leave students with their own experience. I bring it into the intersubjective field. And it might just be very quick, like if I have a large lecture class, if I've got 200 students in a room, I can't have everybody speak at length, but I might say, if we've had a particularly strong practice, and you can usually feel it in the room. My sense is if somebody walks into the room and there's some bozo doing a mindfulness practice in there, if the atmosphere is powerful enough, they'll just sit down and they'll kind of feel it very often. And so in the class, when you have that kind of experience, when you've got 200 students and you could hear a pin drop in that silence, and maybe we've just, and I don't just have them go into the practices to feel their feelings, but to relate to issues around the Anthropocene, ask them for one word, and I call it switchbacking down the classroom and taking the classroom pulse. And so we'll have them say a word, and it might be overwhelmed, terrified, awestruck, grateful, beautiful, and then they name their words, and it really runs the gamut. And so then you get this, and then you get the sense of the diversity of the experience. And then very often I'll ask, is there any word that you heard that did not in some way resonate with your own experience? So that the students can have a sense of actually the breadth of their own experience that can be so much greater than the one word than they might have said. And then that's just a small example, but then to have them do these in their action projects where they come into greater depth with respect to their own personhood, and then they link that to the personhood of other people in the group in service to a larger social project. And it's just amazing because the students come up with such crazy ideas that I would never have thought of, like this one group, I loved their project, it was called Losing the Night. When they saw the picture of the night sky, the NASA picture of the night sky, and they realized that all that light pollution, and they got curious about it, so they partnered with the Seattle Astronomy Society and did a public event on losing the night. And it was just, just because they saw that picture, they did a meditation on it, and they decided to do something about it. And so this engagement of the mind, the heart, and the body through action, I think it mitigates somewhat against the kind of thing that you're talking about, the mindfulness bubble. But we're all, I think many of us are struggling with the fast-paced nature of the world. We need the respite also. So I'm glad if 62% of the students find respite from their otherwise busy lives, because I think that's needed as well. But I think it's important to bring a critical eye to some of this. Yeah, that was a little long-winded, but there was a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah, Jörg, I'm a fellow at the moment here at the Institute. I can also connect to the questions before that. On the one hand, I just heard last week a very interesting feature in the German broadcast about Silicon Valley adapting the mindfulness concept. Yeah. And that you have millions they put in their companies to educate people in trainings, and there are hundreds of millions of research now going on to universities in the States to finance research on brain and mindfulness and meditation and how that works together. So this is a big market. Mm-hmm. So that I think we are already in the state of that the market takes that as a technique, mostly completely without any religious or spiritual context, just the technique, measuring that, and it gives profit, and so though it's okay, so they do it. But my question was more on the open question, how to bring that to institutions, to political institutions, to other institutions, also to companies in a way which is not as only marketing and only selling a technique. And I'm wondering in how far your experience beyond the individual technique with eco-villages or groups of students is that to address that, perhaps we have to look for an institutional function for this meditation, not the individual one. So I think what you mentioned, the dramatization in the eco-village here around SEC, to dramatize something to make the conflict for the whole community more clearer and to solve it is something else than to make the conflict more clear for the individual two persons who have the conflict. So this is, I think, a social function. And what's the word? It's drama. So I had the association of, well, our theaters, our culture, in a way had the function or could have the function to dramatize things, to respite, to respire in that, to just have a little relaxing situation. At the same time, to have a reflection on the situation and perhaps to come out with some idea for a community, for a collective body. So in an institution like I'm working in a ministry, what could be the function and the way for a ministry as a collective institution? Because I think it will be, of course, one way to teach the single people working there in this technique and this context. This might go through in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. A second and additional way could be to think of how to get the institution to see this function and to make, theater in the ministry, or what I'm working on is let's think together about the future in an open way, very intellectually, but in an open way. So is this something which connects to something you do? Because I think your work on eco-villages is in a way, as I didn't read the book, but in a way to try to find a collective level of the meditation and contemplation idea, let's say. But this is not only by individual sitting down and meditate. So what could that be?
Yeah. So just to say something about your first point about Silicon Valley, there's a new institution in Northern California called the Multiversity, and it's a conference facility that tries to be something of a university campus. It's very expensive, it's very beautiful. The Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education just had their annual meeting there. I was pretty mad at them because it was so expensive. But it's a lot of Silicon Valley money going into kind of what, there's this book called Search Inside by one of the folks who started Google. So this is really taking off in that world. And I see it as so many things, that get popularized. It's a mixed bag. But I actually think that it has important possibilities. The point about bringing this into larger collectives, so I think, like when you were talking about thinking about the future, I would say like one way to do that in a group setting is to actually invite the possibility of not only thinking but feeling. And that's a way of, bringing the conversation into a more embodied format, potentially, if the people are open to it. I would say a lot of the thinking that we do is actually an evasion of feeling. We think because we don't want to feel, and so if that's true, and if people are willing to run the experiment of feeling more and seeing what the impact is on their thinking, it could become clarifying. And a lot of this has to do with how close the group is willing to be. In some of the groups that I've had, the action project groups, the students are afraid to do a contemplative practice together because they think it might be embarrassing somehow, and so they don't do it. The projects that are usually the most successful, and the groups that stay together, including long after the projects are done for the class because they keep it going, are the projects where they've developed this sense of deep commitment to each other through the group process, and that requires feeling. So any group, in a business or in politics or in a ministry or at an academic institution or at a church, anywhere, people are always organized around some kind of social purpose. And so having some time to actually contemplate that purpose together in silence, I think is important. I think that there's possibilities, and then the question is always, is there openness amongst the leaders and the participants of a group? And then you see what happens. But my guess is in the next few years, we're going to be seeing a lot of this happening in all sorts of collectives.
I think we have time for one more question, and that goes to Edgar.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm working as a future researcher, and for us also the question always comes up, how can we motivate people, especially decision makers, to take some time, to think more systematically about the future. And I think there has to be a certain degree of self-motivation or of the urge of problem solving. There's something we have to figure out, or we learn that the old solutions are no longer work, if they ever have. So I think this would be the beginning, but at the same time, I think what you mentioned in the beginning is the social imaginary. I think this is a very important thing for organizational development. And my impression is, working with some ministries or some other organizations, that the openness to try something, because many or more people seem to have the feeling, well, we cannot solve the problems we have to solve. So we have to look for other solutions. So this might be one logic, one chain to follow. And if we would be more able to attach emotions to it, or to get deeper into our own emotions or that of a group, I think this would be a very important thing, to combine these different elements.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's lovely. And I would say that one of the blessings, in a sense, of the Anthropocene and the dawning of the Anthropocene is it's telling us that old ways are not working. And so it's opening, it's just as in the natural sciences, when there's a profound anomaly, then there's a search for a new paradigm. And you could say that, the profound anomaly of capitalism, global capitalism, and the growth imperative is that we are unraveling our planetary life support systems. That's a profound anomaly that actually, can lead to the misanthropic temptation, but it also can lead us to really reconsider and reinvent what it means to be human. Yeah, particularly in the affluent countries. So yeah, thank you.
We are now about to continue the discussion in the framework of the theory colloquium at 2:30. Stefan, is that open to everyone who wants to join in from here? Of course. So we pre-circulated a text by Karen Litfin, but I think to follow the discussion, it will not necessarily be required that you have knowledge of that text or have read it. So please join in. We'll meet in the bank building in the room number 2.10 just in a few minutes. You wanted to add something, Karen?
I would like to add something. And if you don't mind, I opened with a poem, and I'd like to close with a poem because I think it lays out it's in some ways a nice bridge from here to there. And it's a poem I shared with you, Franz. In some ways, I think what we're trying to do is intuit what Wendell Berry talks about in this poem, the law that marries all things. The cloud is free only to go with the wind. The rain is free only in falling. The water is free only in its gathering together, in its downward courses, in its rising into the air. In law is rest. If you love the law, if you enter singing into it as water in its descent. Or song is truest law, and you must enter singing as it has no other entrance. It is the great chorus of parts. The only outlawry is in division. Whatever is singing is found, awaiting the return of whatever is lost. Meet us in the air, over the water, sing the swallows. Meet me, the red bird sings, here, here, here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen, once again for a wonderful lecture. And please join